I want to explain now the work that Sarah Harrison and I have done over the years on the village of Tak in the Nepal Himalayas, originally mainly inhabited by Gurung peoples, but more recently by all sorts of groups. This started in some ways before my other digital projects in 1968, but it really took off in the 1980s, so I'm dealing with it now. Like the other projects, this has roots which one can trace back a long way. For instance, the Gurungs themselves are one of the martial tribes, as they were called by the British, who were recruited into the British Gurkhas, famous fighting forces, and in the Second World War, two of my uncles were Gurkha officers, and my father was in the Assam regiment, where there were people from the Nepal hills among the troops. So the family had associations with the Gurungs and the Gurkhas back in the Second World War, and I myself was brought up as a baby in that area in Assam with ayahs who came from the hill peoples around there. I don't know if there were any Gurungs or Nepalis, but there were certainly tribal women looking after me as a baby. And so maybe in a way I felt going home to that area of the world. Certainly when I came to think about doing anthropology, it was natural to think about Assam to go back to, and as I'll explain, I couldn't go there, so I went to Nepal. The previous projects described, that is Earl's Cone and the Nagas, and even to a certain extent the interviews with well-known academics and others, were really historical. You had a set of, in the case of interviews, the lives that had been led up till then. In the case of Earl's Cone, a set of historical documents up to 1854, and with the Nagas, historical documents up to the partition and independence of India. So these were all set lives and documents which we could reconstruct and reorganize, but we couldn't actually create ourselves. This is basically history. What I wanted to do was to add another dimension, which was anthropology. And so at the end of my DPhil at Oxford, 1966, I went for a conversion course to Nepal, to the London School of Economics, 2-year MPhil in social anthropology, which would retrain me as a social anthropologist. And there I learnt the craft, some of the craft skills, but certainly the theoretical apparatus of bits of anthropology from great teachers of that time. And at the end of it, I decided that I must do fieldwork. That's the rite of initiation of an anthropologist, and if I was going to understand anthropology and maybe teach it or write it, then I needed to do fieldwork. So obviously I thought, let's go to Assam, and when I said that word, I was then assigned as my supervisor Christoph von Führer-Heimendorf at the School of Oriental and African Studies, and he arranged for a grant, or helped to arrange a grant from the London Cornell project for my fieldwork. And I wanted to go to work among the Garos or Khasis in the Shillong area. The Naga troubles were in full flood at that time, so after a while it was clear I couldn't go to Assam. And so Heimendorf, who'd been the first British anthropologist from Britain to go to Nepal in 1953 when it opened up, suggested I went to Nepal. Had no idea where Nepal was or anything about it, so he told me a little bit, and he suggested I should go and work with the Gurung people, a Tibeto-Burman people who had migrated down probably from China centuries ago, who'd settled in the Annapurna Mountains of central Nepal above Pokhara. And he'd been there, travelled through that area, and he'd encouraged a young French anthropologist, Bernard Pignade, to work there. And Pignade had produced a wonderful work on the basis of only a few months' field work, Les Gurungs. But then Pignade had tragically died, and there was much more work to be done. So, armed with an address, i.e. Sickless, which Heimendorff had been to, which was under Annapurna 4, my then wife, Jill, and I set off in December 1968 to do field work in the Nepal Himalayas. I really had no idea of what it would be like. What I hoped it would be like was an introduction to what it was like to live in a pre-industrial society. For quite a long time, as I learnt about anthropology, I had felt that many historians couldn't really understand a pre-industrial, that is pre-18th century world, which was the world I wanted to understand, just sitting in their Oxford or Cambridge or London offices reading about it. How would they know what it was like to be sick much of the time, without toilets, without electricity, without many of the comforts and assumptions of the post-industrial world? Wouldn't it be a good idea to actually experience it as well as to read about it? So this might be the basis of a new kind of social history as well as an interesting experience. And so I decided to set out. Now, obviously I needed a theme or topic to study, and at the LSE in particular, and even before that, I'd become very interested in the problem of population. It was clear that population was rocketing after the Second World War. It had been growing for some time, and it was clear that the world's resources were finite. And there was a big movement, most famously in the work of Paul Ehrlich, a biological expert, on the ecological and other context of rapid population growth among animals, including humans. So I went to lectures and classes on demography, and even wrote my first article at that time, which was published on population and the population bomb, as it was often called. So my aim was to go out to Nepal to experience what it was like to live in pre-industrial society, but also to make a contribution to the question of how the world was going to survive the rapid population growth, which was pressing on scarce resources, and nowhere more so than in the steep mountains of the Himalayas. Going through Delhi and then to Kathmandu and then to Pokhara was an extraordinary time change from the Western world. It was still very, very, in our terms, backward, both even in Kathmandu and certainly in Pokhara. When we arrived, the only way you could get into Pokhara was by an aeroplane. There were no roads in, and there were about 5 taxis and a couple of hotels and no Western goods really. It was very, very simple and backward in 1968. So, stocking up with a few provisions, we set off towards Sickless. After going the wrong way and a long route round, we arrived in the village of Tak, absolutely exhausted. Decided we really couldn't go any further. It seemed miles from anywhere, although there was a better route which only took 4 or 5 hours walking down. So we settled down and were given a small house to live in and started anthropological fieldwork. It was a different set of skills from those I'd learnt as a historian. It was talking to people, learning a language of which I hadn't spoken a word before I'd arrived. There were no grammars or dictionaries. And becoming involved in their lives, participant observation. Very tiring, no privacy, a long way to the toilet, very simple food, my wife quite often ill and I ill sometimes, very lonely, not much money, very difficult. It was one of the most difficult times of my life, very homesick, and yet also very exciting, because this was still a shamanic world preserved, much unchanged for centuries. One of the richest shamanic traditions in the world preserved there, and people going about their lives as they had done, farming and herding animals in a way which I would not have been able to experience in the West and in many parts of the world. So we started to document this. As a historian, I was particularly interested in historical documents, so I made as much use as I could of the land records in the village. Also took a very thorough census, did surveys of various aspects of life, took some photographs, and managed to buy a small film camera in Kathmandu, and started to do filming, though it was very expensive and there was no sound and so on. So it was just primitive filming. And remained in that village and went to one or two others, including Moharia, where Pinyate had worked. Stayed in Nepal and on this field trip for 15 months, and then returned with Jill to write the thesis. The thesis was mainly concerned with population and resources, and took a couple of years hard work to do this thesis, which was interesting and was fine and was passed by the examiners, but it was quite dry. Much of the life I'd seen in the village seemed to escape the writing. This is always an effect of writing. It loses the three-dimensional, the colour, the sounds, the smells, the people get excluded to a large extent in any bit of writing, unless you're a very good imaginative novelist or whatever. But this was particularly the case when one was dealing with economics and demography, which was the main themes. Yet it was okay, and when I came to get a job in anthropology, I revised it, and it was published as a book on population and resources. And I wrote a number of articles. So I now had a large filing cabinet full of materials about this first thorough, grounded fieldwork. But I then remarried, had young children, and it was impossible really to go back for a while. So it wasn't until another 16 years later, in 1986, that I went back with Sarah Harrison, my new wife, and we went up for a couple of weeks, and I wasn't sure how it would work out, whether they would remember us, whether we'd enjoy it, whether Sarah would enjoy it. But it was a huge success. They did remember us. The family I'd been adopted into with Bowen Singh, Lieutenant Bowen Singh Gurung, were enormously glad we'd come back. I'd become, in a sense, the son of the family. The oldest son had died tragically, and I was adopted in with all the relatives of that family. We went up to the village, and we both loved it, in particular Sarah. And so we decided that we would come back and make a thorough restudy of the village 16 years later, and continue that study, which is what we did. We came back in 1988 for a much longer period, travelling through other parts of that region, and then in 1990, 1991, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and so on. Sometimes for 2 or 3 weeks, sometimes for 2 or 3 months, and in total we came for 15, 18 trips. It was interrupted in 2003 by the Maoist uprising. There was a gap of 5 years, but then we came again a number of times after 2008. So we must have spent a couple of years over that period, and we have material dating from 1968 to the present, 2012, because we had an informant who sends us updates on what's happening in the village, one of my family, Shana Gurung. So increasingly the power of the capturing media improved. We started, as I mentioned, I started with a very simple camera, tape recorder, did a little bit of tape recording, and went back with the same camera in 1986. But in 1988 I could go back with a video camera, simple analog video camera, which was replaced in 1992 with a better quality video camera. And from about 1990 I started to film seriously. It began to be focused on one or two key people and families. The key person was Badra Singh Gurung, who was an elderly, pretty elderly Gurung, who had taken an interest in the history and culture of that village and was, in a sense, a living book about Gurungs in that area. And so we spent many hours with him going through the census and inventory of properties and village families, and got the inside history of that village in great detail from him. He was very astute and very knowledgeable.
खाने डल्ला सानो हुन्छ कोही मकैको जमरामा बस्छ नि सिद्धेमा हुँदा पेडालुमा हुने पेडालुमा पनि हुन्छ त्यो त्यो किरा मकैको जमरामा पनि हुन्छ त्यो किरा होइन त्यो साउन आषाढ साउनमा पाइन्छ.
And particularly on the filming side, we became adopted into the family of Bowen Singh, and particularly his adopted daughter Dilmaya Gurung and her family. We were encouraged to build a house in their courtyard, and so we would go back to this house and every year catch up on the family and work with her. And I started to focus my films on her life and the life of her only daughter Prem Kumari Gurung. From the age of about 3 to the age of about 12, I filmed her life. And I started not only filming everything they did, going with them to the fields and so on, but also to film some interviews with the family. And in particular in 1992 I did 10 interviews with Dilmaya, 10 20-minute interviews on her veranda, talking about her life and experiences, her dreams, very intimate matters as well as general things. And this was really wonderful. She was a remarkable lady and I learned a great deal from her, and we built up a relationship of trust and depth as brother and sister, adopted brother and sister. Tragically, she died in 1995, and I went back for the funeral, which I filmed, or the memorial ritual, which I filmed in great detail. That, in a sense, took a little bit of the emotion and depth out of the experience, but I did go back with Sarah for most years until 2003 and continued this work. Alongside the recording of the village in depth, there was work with other Gurungs, particularly I.B. Gurung, who was interested in the history, long-term history of the Gurungs. And so we worked with him and other Gurungs to set up a Gurung cultural centre and religious centre in Pokhara, Coimbo as it's called, which he designed and which was replicated elsewhere. With money from overseas Gurungs and little bits we gave and others gave, they set up this remarkable cultural centre and place for training young shamans, museum and so on. And this was very important and remains today as a place where Gurung culture is preserved as it disappears elsewhere. Because the theme of much of the later work was the way in which the Gurungs, on the edge of Western capitalism, with their links to the army, were becoming incorporated into the global society. Transformation is immense. The world I went to in 1968, totally different from 44 years later. Even in the last 3 or 4 years, the village has been totally transformed. When I went there, it was a tremendous effort to get up to the village. In the last 5 years or so, a road has been built up. We thought it was impossible, but there is a road up through the village, which Land Rovers and other strong cars can get to, and goes on up the village. Electricity, which seemed impossible to imagine in the village, is now present in every house. There is the possibility of using mobile phones. Every village family on average has about 3 mobile phones. So before, if you wanted to contact your many relatives, because many Gurungs sent their children abroad, you had to go down and arrange a time, and it was very difficult to contact someone in Malaysia or England or wherever. Now you just ring them up, and if you're trying to organise people in the village, you don't go round to their houses, you ring them up on your mobile phone. And so the communications technology has transformed the village, and even the village school now soon probably will have internet. There are satellite dishes, so village families can tune into hundreds of different channels, and the school will have access, get out soon, to all the wealth of Western and other media. So we documented this. We documented the disappearance of the shaman, or shamanism in the village, the disappearance of the Gurungs on the whole down to the towns and elsewhere, and the predominance now of non-Tibeto-Burman peoples, the blacksmiths, the tailors, the Brahmins, the Chetris. But the village agriculture is not enormously changed. So each year it changed substantially, and we have a record. Compared to other records, it's pretty full. I don't know myself of anyone who went that early and who kept going back and back and back, and who recorded all this not only through the enormously conscientious work of Sarah on the censuses and surveys and filling in what was happening and all the field notes, but also through film, which in 150 hours or more of film records the changing world of a Himalayan village. The problem, of course, is what then to do with this. Up till 1997-8, all I could do was film it, and I made little films which I would show to my students. In particular, I had the idea that it would be nice to have kind of virtual field work in our department. So each year I would assemble some students, and we would eat Nepali food and light incense and maybe have a little bit of the local millet drink, and watch films and recreate and go out to the Himalayas through film. And this was rather successful and people enjoyed it. So this virtual world, I then made films each Christmas with fairly primitive equipment, but the editing equipment and everything else changed, as I've talked about elsewhere, so that around 2000 it became apparent that one could edit this film and make it available to a much wider audience, put it up onto the internet. So that's what I began to do, and I made films under a number of themes, under economic and agricultural life, under religion and ritual, under social life, the interviews and so on, and began to put these up so that there are now some dozens of films, also about how I worked, the interviewing, the filming, the technique, and a film about fieldwork in the village, one of the few films on the internet about how you actually do anthropological fieldwork, which I made for my students and then put up. In 1999, a film company was making a series of films for Channel 4 on the history of the world, and we went up with David Dugan and his son and Carlo to film in Tark, and so we made a few films where I talked about theoretical issues in the village and in other parts of Nepal, and those also we have put up. So there's quite a lot of film which has been appreciated on YouTube and elsewhere by Gurungs with positive comments. But most of the material, that is the censuses and surveys, the fieldwork diaries, our early letters, all that material is in a database, in a multimedia database which Sarah has constructed, and gives the detailed history of this village and how it has changed. 90% of it unpublished and not available, of course, because it raises the whole ethical questions. You gather, as an anthropologist, a lot of very sensitive personal information about people which they give to you and report on others in trust, and it's a very difficult question of how much you should make available. Obviously what we hope to do is to make a time capsule to deposit the films and the records and the database in a safe archive so that it can be looked at in 100, 200 years as a unique record of a changing village. But only a small part of this can be made available straight away, much more than we've done, probably much more of the film and some of the other material, maps and so on, hopefully in an interactive database, but much of it will have to be put on very restricted access or not made available at all. It's a big task. Sarah's done a lot of the work, but to transform it into something that is useful and valuable for others is still a large work ahead. We hope that younger anthropologists and friends will help with this, and we do have one or two friends who are beginning to work on this, who've been to our village and who will work with us on this in the future. So it's being passed on to the next generation through Mark Turin and the World Oral Literature Project and through others in this way. So it's work in progress, and we try to go back every couple of years, but now it's obviously passing on beyond us. But the immense amount of work, perhaps the biggest or the second biggest project I've been involved with, using multimedia, the skills of a historian and an anthropologist and a demographer to record this village, have enriched my life. It's become obviously much more than a research project. It's different from the Nagas and Earl's Cone in that sense. You can't make friends with 17th century villagers in Earl's Cone or even with Nagas in the early part of the 20th century. But the people in this project have become friends, colleagues, family, and we have as deep links with many of them as we do with anyone in the West. It became an alternative world for us, which we inhabited and which enriched our world in so many ways. And it's to them that all this work in the end is most important and is dedicated.